Now, I'm going to board up the windows and the doors. Do you understand? We'll be all right here. We'll be all right here until someone comes to rescue us.
I came late to the zombie party. It wasn't until I was 18 and watched Dawn of the Dead with my good friends Kyle and Rob that I fell in love with the zombie genre as we know it today. What is it that I loved? Not the zombies themselves, but they're fine. There is definitely an appeal there for the monster itself for lots of folks. Specifically, for me, it was less the creature's gore and scares, and more the act of survival, of actually being resourceful. So yeah, obviously there's the zombie genre, but I feel like there's another subgenre under the surface. It's not necessarily beholden to the zombie creature itself, though it owes almost everything to it. For the sake of classification, let's call this subgenre horror siege. In this video, we're going to try to define this, take a look at its origins, as well as what it's morphed into, and finally, what it is that's so damn compelling about it. First, let's all get on the same page. There's a reason we're calling this the horror siege genre and not just the zombie genre. It's important to make that distinction, since that's what me and the editor have been arguing about for about 5 hours before recording this piece. Here's what I mean. 28 Days Later, Resident Evil, and World War Z, those are all zombie films. Yes, 28 Days Later is a zombie movie. Yeah, they're zombies, get over it. They're zombie movies, but I wouldn't consider them horror siege movies, because they lack the siege element. So what is the siege element? On to dictionary.com. Definition number 1. The act or process of surrounding and attacking a fortified place in such a way as to isolate it from help and supplies, for the purpose of lessening the resistance of the defenders and thereby making capture possible. Okay, so this definition works more from a martial point of view. I mean, the concept of the siege has been around as long as people have been getting together and fighting other groups of people, so basically forever. But since many of the horror sieges involve zombies, and zombies aren't a military force, then we need to look at another definition. Dictionary.com definition number 2. Any prolonged or persistent effort to overcome resistance. Bingo! The internet knows everything. Now that siege meets our criteria, let's talk about how that applies to our horror siege genre. But first, we need to define the horror aspect, otherwise we have to include every story involving the siege of a fortress, or a castle, or a bunker, etc. We could do this by saying the horror siege genre has non-military characters, most likely everyday folks with no special combat training. Having no idea how to fight back or defend yourself is pretty horrific if you're stuck in a situation with a bunch of zombies roaming around trying to eat you. Now, the no military folks jives well with the Night of the Living Dead. But what about Dawn of the Dead, Dog Soldiers, Assault on Precinct 13, or even Aliens? Those all feel like they're part of the horror siege family, but they all have main characters with police or military training. So what makes those movies different from, say, Kingdom of Heaven? I think the common thread here is that even though they have characters with combat training defending themselves, they are all thrust into situations they didn't plan for. In Dawn of the Dead, the SWAT officers find them all by chance, and the Colonial Marines and aliens, well, they thought it was just going to be another bug hunt.
Check it out. I am the ultimate badass.
Yet they are all placed in extraordinary circumstances they didn't plan or train for, and they must improvise, adapt, and innovate to survive. That's where the horror comes in. The only thing our characters have on their side are their wits and their environment. There's no backup to come and rescue anyone. They're alone and cut off. Also, relating to that is, it's generally a small group of characters vastly outnumbered by a superior force that threatens to overwhelm them and end their lives. That enemy force is generally less intelligent but has far greater numbers. Since a key element of all this is ending up under siege without any preparation, it follows that the setting must not be something built to fend off an onslaught. This is a slam dunk. Again, no castles, no fortresses, no bunkers, etc. Basically, if you're boarding up windows and doors, you're in a horror siege.
Uh-oh.
To sum up, 1. Has to have a siege that isn't military on military, just good old regular folk. 2. It's an environment that isn't ideal for the defenders. They're caught off guard and have to make do with what they have at their disposal. 3. The characters must be under siege by a larger force that threatens to overwhelm them if they don't use their intelligence and environment to their advantage.
That way they can only come at us from these 2 corridors.
4. No fancy castles or bunkers to help fend off attackers. Gotta board up some doors and windows. So this is by no means concrete. We can play fast and loose with some of these. I'm just taking a stab here, but I think I got the blade in there pretty deep. Without doing a checklist for every movie ever made, let's take a look at how these definitions for the horror siege genre can be applied to a movie that fits, but is definitely not a horror film. Let's try Home Alone. Number 1, not a military siege. Easy, Kevin is a child, and definitely not in the military, and I'm pretty sure the criminals aren't in the military either. I mean, they can't even take on a kid, for Christ's sakes. Number 2, have to improvise. It's not like Kevin had any idea that his family would leave him in Chicago and he would be beset by cat burglars. Number 3, the enemy is a superior force. Well, it is 2-on-1, and those two are adults against a young child. That's a superior and larger force. Number 4, board up those windows. I know Kevin isn't technically boarding up any windows, but I'm pretty sure that the flamethrower, the hot doorknob, the nails, the tar, etc., that all qualifies. Home Alone is basically Night of the Living Dead for children.
This is my house. I have to defend it.
Kevin is the master of traps, and we as the audience love watching him use common household items to make these guys pay for every inch of ground taken. It's that planning and resourcefulness that people love. And while you might say the stakes aren't as threatening as, say, getting eaten alive by zombies, don't forget, Joe Pesci was gonna eat Kevin's fucking fingers one by one.
Every one of these little fingers, one at a time.
At the end of this video, we'll give a rundown of a bunch of other movies we feel are worth checking out and why they fit in this subgenre. What is the history of this genre? Like I said, if we look at siege drama as a whole, we can take it all the way back to the Trojan War and further. But I think the roots of the horror siege genre go back to the 50s. But Night of the Living Dead came out in 1968, you might be thinking. Isn't that where this all started? While Night of the Living Dead is the official birthplace of the modern zombie genre, like anything else, you can always go back and see the kind of stuff that fed into it. Let's take Day of the Triffids, John Wyndham's early post-apocalyptic novel published in 1951, about a world struck blind from a meteor shower's radiation, and a world also running rampant with man-eating mutant plants. The book begins with the main character waking up in a hospital, recovering from an eye injury. As he takes off his eye bandages and traverses a seemingly abandoned hospital, he discovers that most everyone has been struck blind the day before, leaving a hauntingly quiet London for him to explore. Sound familiar? We know we have kids watching these videos, so we gotta cover up this dick here. Don't mind the cursing though, we'll curse all fucking day long. You also have stuff like The Birds, both the 1952 short story and the Alfred Hitchcock classic from 1963, where taking shelter from an overwhelming apocalyptic force is of the utmost importance. In this case, it's just large swarms of birds who want to peck your eyes out. On a less apocalyptic level, there's stuff like Killer Shrews, a beauty from 1959 in which a small group of people are trapped inside a house by giant mutated shrews. They're like field mice. Not mean old ladies, but actually just dogs with shaggy carpet hung over them. The group must find a way to survive, all the while taking shots at each other and shots of liquor. Really, they end up drinking a lot of booze. Or you could look at the Criterion Collection endorsed Fiend Without a Face from 1959, in which the last 15 minutes has the main characters boarding up windows and brandishing .45s to fend off an attack from killer brain creatures. God, I love this shit. Look at how cool those things are. We could make all kinds of inferences about what inspired Night of the Living Dead, the modern zombie genre, and what I consider the cinematic baseline for the horror siege genre. But George Romero has not been shy about what most inspired his little horror film.
And so we decided to do a horror thing. And I had read a novel called I Am Legend, a Richard Matheson novel.
I Am Legend is a novel written by Richard Matheson, published in 1954. It's about a man named Neville, who seems to be the only survivor of a plague that turned everyone else into vampires. The book deals with Neville's day-to-day existence as he attempts to keep his Los Angeles suburban home fortified and retain his sanity. The vampires in I Am Legend terrorize Neville every night. When they're not too busy throwing rocks at Neville's house and screaming at him to come out, sometimes the female vampires try to be a little bit more persuasive. Let's just say they take off their clothes and do things. Sex things. If that sounds out of character, you should know Richard Matheson's vampires are not the typical Dracula-style bougie vampires. Instead, they are more like tweaked-out meth heads. While we're on the topic of different kinds of vampires, you should know that Chinese vampires just win. Go find a movie called Mr. Vampire. It'll be worth your time. Look at that shit. They jump. They fly. They even do kung fu. There's actually 6 movies in this franchise. That's how good it is. Romero definitely took the idea of widespread disease that turns people into monsters and ran with it. But the other big takeaway from I Am Legend was the idea that you could take a very common domestic dwelling and make it the setting for a siege. Almost a full decade after Night of the Living Dead, Romero had an opportunity to make a bigger and bolder sequel. In it, the idea of fortifying normal suburban surroundings went even further with the Monroeville Mall. Instead of simply boarding up windows, now we're parking 18-wheelers in front of entrances. At this point, we're starting to see a trend in zombie movies of finding shelter and fortifying it as much as possible to survive. Then in 1985, Romero made his third entry in the Dead series, Day of the Dead, which is a departure from the playing it by ear, siege-style narrative. But that year, we also got Dan O'Bannon's Return of the Living Dead, with the main characters trapped in a funeral home, surrounded by zombies, trying desperately to keep them out by using furniture and bookcases as makeshift barriers over windows and doors. One other thing we can attribute to Return of the Living Dead is this idea that zombies eat brains. This is really the only movie that put that forward, but it was really popular because a lot of people seem to think that's what they do.
Why do you eat people?
Not people. Brains.
Brains only.
Yes.
There have been plenty of other permutations of the genre in the years following, but none quite as focused on the siege element as those about people holed up in a structure trying to survive. For example, something like 28 Weeks Later has a barn siege, but only in the first 10 minutes of the movie. Or as I mentioned earlier, a science fiction movie like Aliens where Space Marines lay down defense turrets and weld doors shut. It's only a small part of the movie. Even modern action films like 007's Skyfall or The Equalizer, where the hero uses his environment and his wits to defeat a superior force, but they only do it in the finale. Getting out of the realm of movies, the real evolution of this subgenre has been in video games, where the viewer has become the participant. No longer is it a matter of fantasizing about what you would do in those situations, but actually acting out those plans. Personally, as a gamer and a fan of this subgenre, Resident Evil 4 was the first time I felt like a video game understood what I liked about horror siege. I'll never forget how exciting it was the first time I pushed a bookcase in front of a door to keep out zombies. One of the most memorable parts of the game was when you were stuck in a cabin surrounded by zombies. The sequence was deliberately overwhelming due to multiple entry points and no way to defend them all at once. It stressed the player out on purpose to really get a sense of dread, as you just couldn't
Blow the piss out of them?
This sense of barely holding back an overwhelming attack was used in later games like Left 4 Dead, Call of Duty Zombies add-on, and Gears of War 3's Horde mode to great effect. We see the evolution here from simply blocking entryways to setting traps and upgrading defenses. Later this year, we have a game called Rainbow Six Siege, which is pretty much completely devoted to small-scale siege strategy. What is it about this subgenre that makes it so successful? In other words, what is it that appeals to people? I think what it really is at the end of the day is that sense of seeing somebody else use their brain, use their wits, to overcome seemingly insurmountable odds in a way that makes you think that you might be able to do that too. I think Richard Matheson really tapped into that with I Am Legend because it was just a normal guy who was getting by day to day with the things he had around him. When I watch a movie like The Raid or Pacific Rim, these movies are fucking great. But I don't sit there and go like, oh, I wonder how I would use that robot. No, I think that I would have like stepped with my giant left foot before I stepped with my giant right foot before I hit the monster in the face with the giant ship. Those thoughts never crossed my mind. I'm just watching the movie and enjoying these guys. Whereas when I watch something like Return of the Living Dead and they take a certain piece of furniture and put it over there, I go, God, why are they all thinking about furniture? Or they're stacking all the furniture on top of each other in front of the door, but if they put it all side by side against the wall, it would buttress itself against the other wall and then they wouldn't have to worry about it. These are the kind of things that it's really easy to discuss in hindsight and go, oh, it would have been a lot better if I did it this way, but that's the fun of the genre. Okay, so Predator here is by special request from the editor. I love this movie as much as he does, and I think it's a little bit of a stretch, but I get it. The big thing here is Arnie's making all these traps. He sets a certain territory aside, says, between this tree and the jungle, I'm gonna set up a bunch of situations that benefit me against this life form that is way more powerful than me. It's got way better technology, and he does the exploding stick thing. He's got the mud all over him so he can't see. He sets the trap here. He sets the trap there. I get it. It definitely has these horror siege elements there. Along those same lines, you got something like The Equalizer, where he takes the Home Depot and you say, okay, you have Home Depot at your disposal. What could you use all these tools for? How could you really fuck somebody up with it? Shaun of the Dead's, I think, pretty obvious, besides the fact that it actually has zombies in it. You know, they're defending a bar, despite how well you think they do it. And that's part of this, too, is, you know, not everybody is Arnold Schwarzenegger or Denzel Washington. It's as much fun to see somebody try something and fail as it is to watch somebody succeed every time. But they go to the bar, they go there because it's got heavy doors, and they're defending it, so it is in the horror siege genre. If you haven't seen The Professional yet, you should watch that shit. So most of this movie is, of course, you know, Leon getting to know Natalie Portman and all that, and the movie's great, but you do have this climax where maybe he knows he doesn't have a chance, but he's certainly going to go down, not going to go down without a fight. So you got Gary Oldman calling in literally everyone to come and take him down, but he's got all kinds of tricks up his sleeve. In addition to that, when you want to talk about a domestic, pedestrian, mundane area, I mean, he's just defending his apartment. But he knows his apartment, and he knows how to lay traps. He knows how to lay ambushes. He knows how to use those doors, those corners, those hallways, and he even knows how to escape. He had an escape plan. So, horror siege genre, sure.
Don't move.
Okay, so dog soldiers. Dog soldiers, you got your military, but they think that they're going on just a routine operation. They had no idea they were going to run into werewolves. They run into a structure that they had no plan to fortify or anything like that. So that's that whole having to adapt, having to fall back and, you know, deal with circumstances at hand. And they're fighting werewolves, so it fits within the horror genre nicely also. So from Dusk Till Dawn, at one point, they cleared out the vampires, and they are surrounded on all sides in that bar. And they do have to take, I mean, it's a little bit sillier, you know, with the stake jackhammer kind of thing, but they are taking things around them. They're taking the holy water. They're taking resources at their disposal and putting them together in ways that are inventive and resourceful. Assault on Precinct 13 is definitely, to me, one of the purest, most classic examples of this, of course, is John Carpenter. You have a police station that is, it's almost like being decommissioned. They're, as far as, you know, few folks that are left there, they're going to close down the police station and go get some beers. They have no idea that a huge band of gang members plans to take them out systematically, like cutting off their power, using silencers to make sure nobody hears them. This is definitely in the horror siege genre. Okay, so The Mist is in the horror siege genre. This is one of those movies that the editor and I argued about quite a bit. There's not a ton of actual fortification going on. I mean, you basically have them just putting dog food in front of the windows, maybe taking some sticks and wrapping them up in towels and saying, oh, we can light these on fire. But it's still got that we're in here and they're out there mentality. It's an overwhelming force. You know, it's a scary thing. Like, it's giant. It's a whole other fucking dimension of monsters outside. And they do, as fucked up as it is, and as bumbling as it may be, they still try to they still try to fix their situation with their surroundings. Maybe not to the best effect, but they still do it. So Skyfall, this is another one of those things where it's not the whole movie, it's just kind of a great scene at the end, at the climax of the movie. So he kind of knows Harvey R. Bardem and probably a lot of his cronies are going to come at him, so he decides to go to the one place that he's most familiar with, that he's going to be on his territory, which is the house where he grew up. You know, he doesn't have bazookas and, you know, surface-to-air rocket launchers he can shoot at the helicopters and shit. But, you know, he's got a few things at his disposal. He's got some trap doors. He knows the lay of the land. And, you know, he uses that to his advantage. Seven Samurai is a little bit iffy. It for me, it almost falls into the military on military. But there's so much ingenuity on display in terms of taking the very few people they have. It's just the seven samurai and then however many peasants that don't know anything about fighting that they have at their disposal versus, I don't remember how many bandits, but a lot, you know. But they're ticking them off. Like, well, if we do this, we could probably take out 10. If we do this, we can take out another 15 bandits. And it definitely has that siege mentality to it. Walking Dead is actually not really a part of this. I mean, there's a couple things here and there, but there's a lot of roving around in Walking Dead, and a whole lot of just sitting in one spot and talking about things and not really anything much happening. I don't really watch Walking Dead anymore. This is by no means a definitive list. When you're talking about genre stuff, it's always going to be pretty wiggly. We argued back and forth about a lot of this stuff for that very reason. This is just some of the stuff that when we were having all these discussions, a lot of these movies came up more often than not. And it's all pretty interesting. It's all really, some of it's really interesting, some of it's really good. All of it's at least worth checking into. And this is also the stuff that we owned.